Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into how voter engagement, or a lack of it really, has shaped history.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how individual voters can have such a massive impact.
Yeah, like one vote might not seem like much, but when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, wow, it's incredible how those small actions can really add up and lead to some major societal shifts.
Absolutely. And to guide us on this journey, we're turning to the Democracy in Action podcast.
Oh yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, specifically episode 2, the historical impact of voter engagement.
Okay, so what did you find interesting in that episode?
Well, they had some really insightful points, including a really great interview with historian Professor Thandiwe Mbatha. Her work really highlights how interconnected voting and social change really are.
That's really interesting. So she's saying voting isn't just like, checking a box on a ballot. It's more than that.
Right. It's an active force, something that can really dismantle oppressive systems, fuel revolutions, and even drive progress. Powerful stuff. Okay, so let's jump into our first historical example. We're going all the way back to the 1860 U.S. presidential election. Most people know Lincoln won that one.
Right.
But what's super interesting is he actually secured the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote. That's pretty wild.
It really was a fractured political landscape. Four candidates were running, each represented different factions,
Right.
and the nation was deeply divided. So Lincoln's victory wasn't really about a majority. It was more like a perfect storm. Voter turnout in some key states, and the opposition just splintering.
So it wasn't just about how many people voted, it was also about where they were voting and who they were voting for. It all kind of played into this perfect storm idea.
Exactly. The Electoral College system also played a big role.
Oh, right. That's where winning in certain states carries more weight than just like the overall popular vote, right?
Precisely. So it makes you think, how did voter turnout in those specific states affect the outcome? Did certain demographics or regions hold more sway?
It really makes you wonder what could have happened if things were different. Like, what if there was a different distribution of votes? Even with a lower turnout, could it have, changed the course of history? Maybe even prevented the Civil War?
It's definitely a fascinating what if to
Mm.
consider. It really highlights the power of voter engagement and all the ripple effects it can have on a whole nation.
It really shows that every vote matters, sometimes in ways we might not even realize.
Right.
Okay, so speaking of powerful movements, let's fast forward to 1994 and the incredible story of South Africa's first multiracial election, a truly monumental moment after decades of that oppressive apartheid system.
And what's amazing is the voter turnout. Over 86% of registered voters cast their ballots. Really shows how much people wanted change and a more democratic future.
Professor Mbatha actually spoke about this in the Democracy in Action podcast. She described people standing in line for hours, even days, just to cast their vote. It wasn't just checking a box. It was a statement, a rejection of everything they had endured for so long.
It's hard to even imagine that level of dedication. But it speaks to the power of hope, right? That belief that their voices could finally be heard and that they could shape the future of their nation.
It makes you think about all the times in history, all over the world, where people have fought so hard for that right to vote.
And it's important to remember that the fight for voting rights continues in many parts of the world today. The stories of those who struggled for suffrage are so important. They remind us of the privilege and the responsibility we have when we vote.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the fight against racial segregation. Now let's shift gears to another pivotal movement, the fight for women's suffrage. For so long, women were denied a voice in politics. Their concerns and perspectives were ignored.
It's true. The suffrage movement was a long, hard battle. Women used all sorts of tactics to fight for their right to vote. Peaceful protests, petition drives, even hunger strikes and civil disobedience. They faced so much opposition, but their determination ultimately led to a massive change in the political landscape.
And it wasn't just about getting the right to vote. It was about everything that came after that. Once women secured that right, it sparked all sorts of social change. Issues that have been ignored, like education, healthcare, and child welfare, suddenly became important topics in policy debates.
Yeah, the passage of the 19th Amendment in the U.S. back in 1920 is a perfect example of this.
Mhm.
It ushered in an era of social reforms. all driven by women's new political influence.
Wow. It's amazing how expanding who gets to vote can lead to a more inclusive government.
It really is.
Now, we've seen how voter engagement can drive positive change, but, there's another side to this coin. History is also full of cautionary tales. Tales that show us what can happen when there's voter apathy and political fragmentation.
That's right. Sometimes it's not the big revolutions that change societies. It's the slow erosion of democratic norms.
Right.
A really chilling example of this is the rise of Nazi Germany. Of course, a lot of factors contributed to that dark period in history, but low voter turnout in those critical elections played a significant role.
It's hard to believe that such a horrific regime could rise to power in a democratic society. How did that even happen?
It was a gradual process, but apathy and disillusionment among a lot of the population allowed extremist parties to take advantage of the system. They didn't have widespread support, but the silence and inaction of those who didn't engage allowed them to gain a foothold.
So basically, not participating created a vacuum, and that vacuum was filled by those extremist ideologies. It's a reminder that our democracies are fragile, and that we need to actively participate to prevent extremism and authoritarianism.
Couldn't agree more. It raises a big question for us all. Why do people choose not to engage in politics? And what are the consequences of that choice? We all need to think about that, especially today when there's so much misinformation and polarization.
Definitely something to consider. We'll explore that more in the next part of our deep dive. But for now, I think it's clear silence can be just as impactful as a vote. Choosing not to participate can have unintended and far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. Our democracies depend on informed and engaged citizens. We all need to be critically aware, evaluate the information we see, and understand the power we have, both through our actions and our inactions.
Okay, so let's shift gears again. We've talked about a lot of heavy stuff. Let's move to a more hopeful chapter. The civil rights movement in the U.S. during the 1950s and 60s.
That era was full of struggle and sacrifice, a testament to the courage and resilience of so many people who demanded equality and justice.
And a core part of their fight was this understanding that true equality requires equal rights under the law and equal access to voting.
They knew that political power comes from participating in the democratic process, and they were willing to risk everything to secure that right, even facing violence, intimidation, and systemic obstacles that were meant to silence them.
Their efforts led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a landmark victory that outlawed discriminatory voting practices. And that paved the way for greater representation of African Americans in government. It also led to policy shifts addressing important issues like civil rights, education, and economic opportunity.
It's a truly powerful example of how voter engagement can bring positive change, transform societies, and empower marginalized communities.
It all comes back to that basic idea, right? Every vote has the power to create change, to help build a better future.
It's a reminder that our democracies are always evolving, shaped by the collective will of the people.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into voter engagement.
We've seen how it shaped major historical events, from the abolition of slavery to the dismantling of apartheid to the fight for gender equality.
And we've seen how important it is to understand voter turnout, demographics, and political systems. They're all part of how democracies work.
It's a complex and fascinating story. And it doesn't end there. In part 2, we'll be back to explore how technology and social media are changing how we participate in democracy. It's creating new opportunities, but also new challenges.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to our deep dive. It's amazing to see how those historical examples we talked about connect to what's happening in the world today.
Totally. It's really interesting to see how those past struggles for voting rights have kind of paved the way for how we participate in democracy now. I mean, think about it. We've gone from standing in line for days to vote to being able to just click a button on our phones.
It's incredible how much technology has changed things. But it's not all sunshine and roses. While technology has made it easier for people to get involved and learn about what's going on, there are definitely some new challenges that come with it.
That makes sense. I guess almost every advancement has a downside, right? So what are some of the challenges that come with technology and voter engagement?
Well, one big one is the spread of misinformation and echo chambers on social media. It's getting harder to figure out what's true and what's not. People tend to only see information that supports their beliefs, even if it's biased or inaccurate.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that happen in online discussions. People
Yeah.
get really stuck in their opinions, even when you show them evidence that contradicts what they believe.
Exactly. And this bias can influence how people vote. They might be more likely to support a candidate who shares their views, even if that candidate's policies aren't really good for them, or go against their values in other areas. It's important to realize that we all have biases, and to be aware of how they might be shaping our views.
So it's not just about being informed, it's also about being aware of our own blind spots.
Yeah.
And how they might be distorting the information we come across.
Precisely. Another interesting thing is something called the availability heuristic. It's basically our tendency to overestimate the importance of information that we can easily access. For example, if we keep seeing negative news stories about a particular candidate, we might start to see them in a bad light, even if those stories don't represent their whole record.
Oh, it's like that saying, if it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
Right. The things that grab our attention the most aren't always the most representative or important.
Exactly. We need to be careful about what information we pay attention to, especially these days when the media often focuses on sensationalism rather than nuance.
Okay, so we've talked about confirmation bias and the availability heuristic. Are there any other psychological tricks that affect us when we vote?
Well, social pressure can also have a big impact. We often feel like we have to vote a certain way because our family, friends, or community expects us to. This is especially true in close-knit groups, where fitting in is really important.
It's like that need to belong, but in the world of politics, we want to align ourselves with our social circles, even if it means ignoring our own doubts or disagreeing with others.
That's right. It's important to recognize those social pressures and make sure we're voting based on what we truly believe, not just what other people expect of us.
It's a tough balance, though. We want to have meaningful conversations about politics with our communities, but we also need to make sure we're not just following the crowd blindly.
You're right. It's about finding that balance between individual autonomy and social responsibility.
So it sounds like we're all influenced by biases and social pressures in ways we might not even realize. It's a bit humbling to think about. But can we use this knowledge to make better decisions? Can understanding these psychological dynamics help us become more informed and engaged voters?
Absolutely. The first step is awareness. Once we recognize our own biases, we can start to question our assumptions and look for different perspectives. We can actively seek out information that challenges our beliefs, even if it's uncomfortable.
So it's about breaking out of those echo chambers and being open to hearing viewpoints that differ from our own.
Exactly. It's about developing a more nuanced understanding of the issues and recognizing that there aren't always simple answers. And when we understand how social pressure works, we can make a conscious effort to base our voting decisions on our own analysis and values instead of just going along with what everyone else is doing.
That's a great point. It's about taking responsibility for our choices and realizing that our vote is a reflection of what we believe in and what we care about.
Exactly. It's about seeing voting not just as a right, but as a responsibility. It's our chance to help shape the world we want to live in and to make our voices heard on the issues that matter most to us.
Wow, you're right. That's such an important reminder. So as we move into this next section of our deep dive, I'm really curious to hear what modern day examples you have of voter engagement. What are some inspiring stories where people have used technology to make a difference?
Oh, there's so many great examples. One that comes to mind is the Arab Spring uprisings that happened back in the early 2010s. Social media was a huge factor in those movements. People used platforms like Twitter and Facebook to organize protests, share information, and connect with others who wanted democratic reforms.
I remember following those events. It felt like the whole world was watching as people took to the streets to demand change. It was really powerful to see people coming together and demanding change.
It really showed how technology can amplify voices that are often ignored and connect people from all over the world. Of course, it's important to remember that not all of those uprisings led to lasting change. Some were met with violence, and others led to conflict and instability.
That's true. The Arab Spring was a really complex event with both successes and failures, but it's definitely a reminder that the fight for democracy is an ongoing process and that progress isn't always straightforward. It takes constant effort and adaptation.
I completely agree. It's important to look at these movements with a critical eye and understand both their potential and their limitations. Another interesting trend is the rise of issue-based activism, especially among younger generations.
You mean movements that focus on things like climate change, social justice, or gun control?
Exactly. Those issues are motivating young people to get involved in politics in new and creative ways. They're not waiting for traditional institutions to take the lead. They're organizing online, getting their communities involved, and demanding action from their elected officials.
It's amazing to see them using the tools and platforms they're familiar with to make a difference. They're taking charge of their future and demanding action on issues that matter to them.
And it's not just about voting in elections. They're also involved in advocacy, holding their leaders accountable, and participating in grassroots movements. It's a more holistic approach to civic engagement. It's about recognizing that democracy is about more than just casting a ballot every few years.
I love that idea. It's about making activism a part of their lives and realizing they have the power to create change in their communities and beyond.
Exactly. It's about understanding that each of us has a role to play in shaping the world we want to live in.
So, with all these new forms of engagement popping up, what do you think the future holds for voter participation? Are we moving toward a more engaged and informed citizenry?
I really hope so,
Yeah.
but it's hard to say for sure. We're facing some big challenges right now, like political polarization, declining trust in institutions, and the spread of misinformation. It feels like we're at a crossroads. You're right, there are definitely obstacles in our way. But I also see reasons to be hopeful. Young people are more engaged than ever. Technology is opening up new ways to participate. And there's a growing awareness of how important civic engagement is for a healthy democracy.
It sounds like there are reasons to be both optimistic and cautious. The future of democracy is really uncertain.
That's the truth. It's not predetermined. The future of democracy depends on us, on whether we're willing to engage, educate ourselves, and hold our leaders accountable. We need to remember that democracy isn't a spectator sport. It requires active and informed participation from all of us.
And that participation can take many forms. It's not just about voting, it's about having conversations, advocating for change, and holding our elected officials responsible. It's about recognizing that we all have a stake in shaping the future of our communities and our country.
You said it perfectly.
Mm.
It's also crucial to remember that not everyone has equal access to participation. There are still barriers that prevent many people, especially those from marginalized communities, from fully exercising their right to vote.
That's an important point. We can't talk about voter engagement without addressing the systemic obstacles that disproportionately affect certain groups. Can you give us some examples of these barriers?
Absolutely. Things like voter ID laws, gerrymandering, a lack of polling places, and felony disenfranchisement are just a few examples of tactics that can reduce voter turnout among specific groups. These practices often target communities of color, low-income individuals, and young people, making it harder for them to have their voices heard in elections.
It's disheartening to see these tactics being used to silence certain groups and undermine the principle of equal representation. So, what can be done to fight these injustices and ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to participate in democracy?
Well, there's a growing movement pushing for electoral reforms like automatic voter registration, early voting,
Yeah.
and same-day voter registration. These measures have been shown to increase voter turnout and make it easier for everyone to vote.
Those sound like practical solutions that could really make a difference. And it's not just about changing laws, is it? It's also about educating people about their rights, mobilizing communities to get involved, and holding elected officials accountable for making sure elections are fair and equitable.
Exactly. It's a multifaceted approach that requires legal reforms, grassroots organizing, and public education. It's about creating a culture of civic engagement and empowering everyone to exercise their right to vote.
It's about building a democracy that truly reflects the will of all the people, where everyone has a voice and a say in shaping the future.
You put it perfectly. It's a collective effort that requires all of us to be engaged, informed, and committed to building a more just and equitable society.
Okay, so in this part of our deep dive into voter engagement, we've really explored some important ideas.
We've talked about how technology has changed the landscape of political participation and highlighted its potential for both good and bad. We've seen the power of collective action in movements like the Arab Spring and the rise of issue-based activism. We've also acknowledged that systemic barriers still exist, preventing many people from fully participating in democracy. This emphasizes the need for continuous advocacy and reform.
It's been a really interesting and thought-provoking conversation so far. In the final part of our deep dive, we're going to go even deeper into the psychology of voting. We'll look at what influences our decisions at the ballot box, the role of emotions, biases, and social pressures in shaping our political choices, and how understanding these psychological dynamics can help us become more informed and engaged citizens. Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive into the power of voter engagement. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the power of voter engagement. We've covered so much ground already, from historical turning points to the impact of technology.
It's been quite a journey, and now we're going to shift our focus inward to explore the fascinating world of voting psychology.
Okay, voting psychology. So we're talking about what's going on in our heads when we're making those decisions in the voting booth.
Exactly. We often think of ourselves as rational voters, carefully weighing the pros and cons of each candidate and issue. but the reality is much more complex.
Oh, I bet. So you're saying there's more to it than just logic and facts.
Absolutely. Our choices are influenced by a whole range of psychological factors, many of which we might not even be aware of.
That's kind of freaky, actually. So what are some of those sneaky psychological factors that are secretly pulling the strings?
Well, one of the big ones is something called confirmation bias. It's our natural tendency to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Okay, that makes sense. We all like to be right. But how does that play out in the context of voting?
Well, it means we might be more likely to seek out news sources and opinions that align with our existing worldview, even if those sources are biased or incomplete.
I've definitely noticed that online. People tend to gravitate toward echo chambers where everyone agrees with them.
Exactly. And that can affect how we vote. We might be more likely to support a candidate simply because they share our views, even if their policies don't really benefit us or align with our values and other areas.
So it's not enough to just be informed. We also need to be aware of our own biases and how they might be shaping our perceptions.
Precisely. Another interesting factor is the availability heuristic. It's the tendency to overestimate the importance of information that's easy for us to recall.
Okay, I think I'm getting that. So if we keep hearing about something over and over again, we might think it's more common or important than it really is.
Yeah, got it. Think about it this way. If the news is constantly covering negative stories about a particular candidate, even if those stories are a small part of their overall record, we might start to see them in a more negative light.
That's true. It's like that old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. Sensational stories tend to stick in our minds more than the less dramatic ones.
Exactly. It's a good reminder to be critical of the information we consume, especially in today's media landscape.
Okay, so we've got confirmation bias and the availability heuristic. What other psychological tricks are at play when we're trying to make those voting decisions?
Well, we can't forget about social pressure. The people around us, our family, friends, our community, they can all influence our choices.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. We want to fit in, right? And sometimes that means aligning ourselves with the views of our social group.
Exactly. And while there's nothing wrong with sharing political views with those close to us, it's important to be aware of how that social pressure might be shaping our thinking. Are we truly making our own decisions, or are we just following the crowd?
It's like we have to find that balance between staying true to ourselves and maintaining those social connections.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a balancing act for sure.
Wow, it's kind of mind-blowing to realize how many hidden factors are at play when we vote. But is there a way to use this knowledge to our advantage?
Absolutely. Awareness is key. Once we understand these biases and social pressures, we can start to counteract them.
So how do we do that?
Well, we can be more intentional about the information we consume, actively seek out diverse perspectives, even those we disagree with. And most importantly, remind ourselves that our vote is a reflection of our own values and beliefs, not just the expectations of others.
It's about taking ownership of our choices and making sure our vote reflects what we truly care about.
Precisely. And that's what makes voter engagement so powerful. It's about understanding that our choices matter, that each of us has a role to play in shaping the world we want to live in.
It's inspiring to think about, really. So, as we wrap up this incredible deep dive, what's the one message you want our listeners to take with them?
Voting isn't just a simple act of marking a ballot. It's the culmination of individual stories, historical struggles, and yes, all those complex psychological factors we've been discussing. Approach this right and privilege with intention. Make your voice heard. And that's a wrap on our exploration of voter engagement. Thanks for joining us on this journey. It's been a fascinating look at how individual actions can shape history, how technology is transforming our participation, and the surprising ways our minds work when we step into that voting booth. Remember, every vote counts. Make yours matter.